She invited me to a family dinner, smiled like nothing was wrong, and I had no idea she was about to humiliate me in front of everyone who ever mattered. At least, not yet. I remember standing in front of the mirror that evening, smoothing my dress, telling myself this was just another awkward family gathering. I told myself I was overthinking it. I always did that, making excuses for people who never made excuses for me. Family dinners were never easy. They were loaded with expectations, quiet judgments, and the kind of smiles that felt sharp around the edges. Still, I went, because I believed family meant safety, because I believed showing up mattered. That belief would cost me more than I realized. My name doesn't matter as much as what happened that night. I was in my early 30s, recently divorced, rebuilding my life piece by piece. Not glamorous, not tragic enough to earn sympathy, just real. I worked hard, paid my own bills, tried to stay invisible when people whispered. And yet, somehow, I was always the topic. The invitation came from her, my sister-in-law. She framed it as a peace offering, a fresh start, a chance to bring the family together after months of uncomfortable distance. I should have questioned why she suddenly cared. But when someone invites you to a family dinner, you don't expect family dinner drama. You expect small talk, overcooked food, maybe a passive-aggressive comment if you're unlucky. You don't expect public humiliation. When I arrived, everything looked normal. Too normal. The table was beautifully set. Everyone was already there. Conversations stopped for half a second when I walked in, just long enough for me to feel it. Then the smiles returned. She hugged me tightly, whispered how good it was to see me, and guided me to my seat like a gracious host. If I didn't know better, I would have believed her. But something was off. Every compliment felt rehearsed. Every laugh lingered a second too long. I caught glances exchanged across the table. Quick looks, loaded looks. This wasn't just dinner. This was a stage, and I was the only one who hadn't rehearsed. As plates were passed around, I tried to relax, tried to remind myself that paranoia was a side effect of stress, that not every silence meant judgment. Still, my chest felt tight. Because deep down, I knew what this was becoming. I had seen this pattern before, the slow setup, the careful positioning, the kind of moment that turns into revenge later, when you finally understand what you were meant to endure. But at that table, under warm lights and forced laughter, I hadn't connected the dots yet. I didn't know that karma was already moving quietly in the background, and I definitely didn't know that this family dinner would change the way I trusted people forever. At first, the conversation stayed harmless. Work updates, weather complaints, stories everyone had heard before. But then the questions started drifting toward me. They were subtle, soft, wrapped in concern. "So, how are you really doing?" someone asked, smiling politely. Not, "How are you doing?" but, "How are you really doing?" The kind of question that sounds caring but invites commentary. I answered carefully, short sentences, neutral tone. I had learned that lesson the hard way. That's when she leaned in. My sister-in-law tilted her head, the way people do when they pretend to empathize. She said my name gently, like she was worried about me. "I just hope you're not struggling financially," she said, out loud, at the table. The room went quiet for half a second. Not shocked quiet, expectant quiet. I felt heat rush to my face. I laughed it off, said I was managing fine, that I was working a lot, that everything was under control. She nodded slowly, too slowly. "Well, that's good," she replied, "because starting over at your age isn't easy." There it was. Not an insult, not yet, just a reminder, placed delicately in front of everyone. This is how family dinner drama begins, not with shouting, but with tiny cuts disguised as concern. The comments kept coming, a remark about how brave I was to show up alone, a joke about how dating these days must be exhausting for someone like me, a question about whether I'd considered moving back home if things got too hard. Each line landed softly, but together they built something heavy. I looked around the table, hoping someone would interrupt, deflect, change the subject. No one did. Some people avoided eye contact, others watched closely, like this was entertainment. That's when I realized this wasn't accidental public humiliation. It was coordinated. She wasn't just talking to me, she was talking about me, using me as a reference point, a cautionary tale. And the worst part? She never raised her voice, never sounded cruel. That's how gaslighting works. If you react, you look unstable. If you stay silent, the narrative writes itself. So I stayed calm, smiled when expected, answered when necessary. Inside, something was unraveling. I started replaying moments from the past, comments she'd made, stories she'd accidentally shared, things I had brushed off. This wasn't new. This was just the first time it had an audience. As dessert was served, she cleared her throat and glanced around the table. I saw the shift in her posture, the way people straighten up before delivering something important. That's when I knew. The real moment was coming, and whatever she was about to say next, it wasn't meant for me alone. This was no longer just an uncomfortable family dinner. This was a setup, carefully planned, emotionally precise, and I still had no idea how far she was willing to go. She didn't announce it. She didn't tap her glass or raise her voice. She just smiled and said, "Since we're all together, there's something I think we should talk about." Every instinct in my body went cold. She turned slightly toward me, but not fully. That way, it didn't look like an attack. It looked like a discussion. "I've been worried," she continued, "about some choices you've been making." There it was again. Concern. Soft, carefully worded concern. I opened my mouth to respond, but she kept going. "You know, when you called me crying last month," she said, glancing around the table, "it really scared me." I froze. That call was private, late at night, after I'd had a terrible day. I had trusted her. The room leaned in, emotionally, not physically. People were listening now. I felt exposed, like someone had opened a window inside my chest. She sighed, shaking her head slowly. "I just don't think everyone here realizes how fragile things have been for you." Fragile. That word echoed louder than anything else. I tried to speak, tried to clarify, but every sentence I started sounded defensive, even in my own head. This is how public humiliation works, not with lies, but with selective truth. She didn't say anything technically false, she just framed it. She talked about my stress, my divorce, my emotional moments. Moments I had survived, moments I thought were human. Now they were evidence. Across the table, someone cleared their throat. Another person nodded sympathetically. Not at me, at her. She was controlling the narrative, and I was losing ground fast. "This is a safe space," she added quickly. "I just think honesty is important in families." Safe. That word felt almost cruel. I felt my pulse in my ears. My hands trembled slightly under the table. I realized then that this wasn't about helping me. This was about positioning. She was the stable one, the responsible one, the hero, and I was the example, the unspoken warning. That's when I noticed something else. She wasn't looking at me anymore. She was watching everyone else's reactions, measuring, adjusting. This wasn't emotional, it was strategic. And suddenly, the entire family dinner drama made sense. The invitation, the timing, the audience. This wasn't about concern, this was about control. I swallowed hard and forced myself to stay composed, because I knew deep down that if I broke now, I would hand her exactly what she wanted. And yet, staying silent felt like agreeing. That's the trap. You don't realize you're in it until every option feels like a loss. I didn't know how to stop what was happening, but somewhere inside that quiet panic, something else started forming. Not anger, awareness. And once you see the pattern clearly, revenge doesn't come from rage, it comes from patience. I just didn't know yet how long I'd have to wait for karma to catch up. The room felt smaller. Not physically, but emotionally. The air grew heavy, like everyone was waiting for me to either explain myself or collapse. I chose neither. I sat there, hands folded in my lap, breathing carefully.
Every instinct told me to defend myself, to clarify, to tell them she was twisting things. But something stopped me. I looked around the table and realized something terrifying. They had already decided who I was in this story, not because of facts, but because of framing. Anything I said now would sound like denial, or worse, proof. That's when she delivered the final blow. "I just think," she said softly, "that sometimes people don't realize how their choices affect everyone else." She paused, let the words sink in. "Especially when they're emotionally unstable." There it was, no longer implied, spoken clearly enough to land, vague enough to deny later. My chest tightened. I felt my throat close, the familiar pressure behind my eyes. Not tears yet, just the warning. This wasn't just public humiliation anymore. This was character assassination, and it was happening slowly, politely, in front of people who would remember it long after dessert was gone. Someone finally spoke, not to challenge her, to comfort me. "I'm sure she didn't mean it that way," a relative said gently, placing a hand over mine. The gesture felt kind, but it sealed my role, the fragile one, the problem. I nodded, forcing a small smile, because correcting them would only make things worse. That's when it hit me. This entire family dinner drama had been engineered to make me look exactly like this: quiet, overwhelmed, unstable. Not because I was, but because silence was the safest response. My heart was pounding, but my face stayed calm. I washed my hands slowly, grounding myself, breathing, thinking. Because while she was focused on controlling the room, she had overlooked something important. She had exposed herself, not to everyone, but to me. When I returned to the table, I didn't apologize, didn't explain. I simply thanked everyone for dinner and said I wasn't feeling well. She looked surprised, just for a second, not because I left, but because I left calmly. That's the moment she lost control, without realizing it. Because revenge doesn't start with anger, it starts with clarity. And while they thought the night had ended with my quiet defeat, I was already mapping something else, something patient, something undeniable, something that didn't need confrontation to let karma do the talking.
I didn't confront her. I didn't text anyone afterward. I didn't explain my side. That silence wasn't weakness. It was strategy. People assume revenge has to be loud to be effective. They expect shouting, exposure, dramatic exits. But the most damaging moves happen quietly, when the other person thinks they've already won. After that family dinner drama, I pulled back just enough to observe. I stopped volunteering information, stopped correcting assumptions, stopped trying to manage how I was perceived. And something interesting happened. She got careless. Without my emotional reactions to feed on, she started overplaying her role, telling my story a little too often, adding details that hadn't existed before. I heard about it indirectly. "She seems really worried about you," someone mentioned casually one day. The tone wasn't concerned anymore. It was confused. That's how public humiliation backfires, when the audience starts noticing inconsistencies. I didn't rush to defend myself. I let the gaps speak. Instead, I focused on rebuilding quietly. I stabilized my finances, took on extra projects, documented everything: emails, timelines, conversations. Not obsessively, methodically, because clarity beats emotion every time. Meanwhile, she kept positioning herself as the responsible one, the caretaker, the truth teller. But the more she talked, the more people noticed the pattern. Every story placed her at the center. Every warning made her look superior. Every concern subtly elevated her status. It stopped sounding like care. It started sounding like control. That's when the first crack appeared. A family member asked me privately, "Did you really say all those things she mentioned?" I didn't answer defensively. I didn't accuse her. I simply said, I shared a difficult moment with someone I trusted. I didn't expect it to become dinner conversation. I let the silence sit. People are smarter than manipulators assume. They just need space to notice. That's the part no one tells you about karma. It doesn't rush. It waits until the person reveals themselves fully. And she did. At another gathering, one I wasn't even at, she repeated the same story again, but this time someone gently pushed back. "Didn't you already tell us that?" they asked. A harmless question, but her reaction wasn't harmless. She stiffened, corrected herself too quickly, added a detail that contradicted an earlier version. That's all it takes. Once doubt enters the room, it doesn't leave quietly. I never asked anyone to take my side. I didn't need to. I just stayed consistent, calm, stable, unbothered. And in contrast, her behavior started standing out, sharp against my silence. That's the real revenge. Not destruction, exposure through repetition. By the time people started seeing the truth, I was already somewhere else emotionally, free. And she was still trying to control a narrative that no longer belonged to her. I didn't hear about it right away. That's how you know karma is real. It doesn't announce itself. It just starts rearranging things when you're no longer watching. Weeks passed after that infamous family dinner drama. I stayed distant but polite, present when necessary, invisible when possible. And slowly, the tone around her began to change. At first, it was subtle. People stopped asking her for updates about me, stopped nodding automatically when she spoke, stopped reacting with sympathy. Instead, they started asking questions, not accusatory ones, curious ones. Why are you so involved in her situation? She seems fine every time I see her. Did she ask you to share that? Questions like that don't sound dangerous, but to someone who thrives on narrative control, they're destabilizing. The real shift happened during another gathering. I wasn't there, but later someone told me what happened. She brought me up again, almost out of habit, a comment about how she hoped I was finally doing better. Someone laughed lightly and said, "She's been doing better for a while now, hasn't she?" Another person added, "Yeah, she seems more grounded than most of us lately." Silence followed. Not awkward silence, uncomfortable silence. She tried to recover, smiled, corrected, reframed, but the room didn't follow her lead this time. That's when public humiliation quietly reversed direction. Not onto me, onto her. People started noticing patterns they hadn't questioned before. How often she positioned herself as the savior, how every story centered on her insight, her concern, her moral clarity. It didn't look noble anymore. It looked performative. And once that realization lands, it spreads fast. I noticed it in small ways: fewer invitations, shorter conversations, people fact-checking her casually. She reached out to me once, a neutral message, too neutral. "Hope you're doing okay, haven't seen you much." I read it twice, and didn't respond. Not out of spite, out of closure, because by then the balance had already shifted. She no longer had an audience willing to play along. That's the part manipulators never anticipate. They think the story is the power, but consistency is stronger. I didn't need to expose her, didn't need to explain. I just lived well, and that made the contrast undeniable. Eventually, people stopped asking me about her too. They didn't need to. They had seen enough. That's what real revenge looks like. Not punishment, consequences. By the time she realized she'd lost credibility, I was already moved on emotionally. No anger, no bitterness, just clarity. Because when karma arrives naturally, it doesn't feel dramatic. It feels fair. After everything settled, I expected to feel triumphant. I didn't. What I felt instead was quiet. Not the heavy silence from that family dinner drama, but a calm one. the kind that comes when you're no longer bracing yourself for impact. I realized how much energy I had spent trying to be understood, trying to explain myself to people who had already chosen a version of me that made them comfortable. Letting go of that was freeing. The night I was invited to be shamed, that moment of public humiliation used to replay in my head, every word, every pause. But over time, it lost its power. Not because I forgot it, but because I understood it. She didn't do it because I was weak. She did it because I was convenient. People who crave control don't attack strength directly. They chip away at it, hoping it will crumble quietly. That realization changed how I moved through the world. I stopped oversharing, stopped explaining myself to people who hadn't earned access to my story, stopped mistaking proximity for loyalty. I also stopped villainizing her. That surprised me the most. Holding on to anger would have meant she still had influence over my emotions, and I wasn't willing to give her that. Instead, I took what happened as information about boundaries, about patterns, about how manipulation often wears the mask of concern. The revenge wasn't watching her lose credibility, that was just the outcome. The real victory was learning to trust myself again, to recognize when something feels off, even if it looks polite, calm, or well-intentioned on the surface. I started choosing spaces where I didn't have to shrink, where silence wasn't weaponized, where care didn't come with an audience. And slowly, I felt lighter. That's the part people don't talk about when they discuss karma. It's not just about someone else getting what they deserve. It's about you no longer carrying what was never yours to hold. I didn't walk away from that experience hardened. I walked away clearer, more selective, more grounded. I learned that dignity isn't proven in confrontation, it's proven in restraint. And sometimes the most powerful response to being humiliated publicly is to rebuild privately, until the truth doesn't need your voice anymore. I never confronted her, not because I was afraid, but because I no longer needed her to understand what she had done. The truth had already settled where it needed to. That family dinner drama became a turning point, not because of the shame, but because of what followed. The clarity, the calm, the choice to stop performing for people who benefited from misunderstanding me. I learned that public humiliation only works when you keep trying to earn back dignity from the same people who took it. The moment you stop asking, it loses its power. I don't tell this story to prove I was right. I tell it because situations like this happen quietly everywhere. At work, in families, in relationships where concern is used as leverage. And if you've ever walked away from a room feeling smaller than when you entered, if you've ever realized too late that the invitation wasn't about connection but control, then you already understand. The revenge wasn't the silence. It wasn't watching her lose credibility. It was choosing peace without needing permission. And karma arrived with balance, with truth no longer needing defense, with freedom. I walked away lighter, not untouched, but unburdened. And that, more than anything else, felt like justice. So now I'm curious. If you were invited to a family dinner and slowly realized it was meant to shame you, would you speak up in the moment, or would you walk away and let time reveal the truth?